A 7-year-old homeless girl was allowed to play the violin for the guests. When the owner returned, he was angry to see the dirty girl in his hall. He approached her to kick her out, but then he froze in surprise. "Oh my God," he said. "This can't be. Where did she get that violin?" The girl, Sophia, had been wandering the streets of the big city barefoot, her feet cracked from the cold. Her face was stained with mud, and her eyes were filled with an attentive look, like she was always searching for something or waiting for someone. With her, there was only one thing: an antique violin made of dark wood, which had been worn over the years. This instrument was the last gift her mother had given her, fragments of her life that Sophia could barely remember. At every corner, the girl would stop, her hands trembling with hunger and fatigue. She would bring the violin to her chin, and her music would sound strong and emotional, conveying pain and lost hopes. Despite her fragile appearance, her music was powerful. Music was the only connection she had with the world. It was the last thread that kept her dignity. One evening, a cold wind blew through her thin coat, and she stopped at the old bridge. At her feet, there lay a dilapidated violin case with barely visible coins that people had thrown without stopping. Sophia picked up the violin, covered her chin with a wool scarf to protect herself from the cold, and began to play. The melody echoed over the empty streets, enveloping the old houses and the cracked asphalt. The sound was so deep and piercing that a passerby, an elderly man with a walking stick, stopped to listen. He leaned on the railing of the bridge and looked at the fragile girl. His face reflected sadness, and his eyes shone with emotion. "You have a little talent," he said softly, coming closer. "But why are you here alone? Where are your parents?" Sophia did not answer. She continued to play with her eyes closed, trying to hide in her music from other people's questions. Her slender fingers moved gracefully over the strings. Despite the fact that the strings were covered with small cracks and red spots from the cold, the man stood there until the melody ended. He quietly placed several large coins and a bag of warm pies into the violin case, which he had just purchased at a nearby store. "Take care of yourself," he said as he left. But he looked back for a long time at the frail figure of the girl, who seemed to be from another world. Sophia looked at the case with food and coins, and a faint smile appeared on her face. But it soon disappeared, replaced by her usual expression of longing. She took one pie and put the rest in her pocket, then put the violin back in its case. She continued on, knowing that music was all she had. Sometimes, amidst an indifferent crowd, coins would fall in front of her like tiny sparks of kindness. That evening, after another exhausting day, she glowed like a lighthouse in the darkness, shining through the windows that opened onto a different world. The doors were slightly open, and Sophia's stomach rumbled loudly. This world was far from reality, but her instincts made her approach the restaurant. Maybe she could play for the customers and earn a few coins. She adjusted her violin, her fingers trembling from the cold, but she tried not to let it distract her. Sophia brought the instrument to her chin, took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play on the sidewalk outside the brightly lit restaurant. The melody started softly, like a gentle whisper in the night. But with each stroke of the bow, it became more powerful. Her music gained strength from her hopes and sorrows, cutting through the urban noise like a silent prayer. It sounded like a warm stream in the cold silence of the city. The music played by the young violinist penetrated the hearts of the people, slowing down their steps. At first, the passers-by stopped, puzzled, but soon their faces began to change. Tears appeared in some eyes. Some people stood still, as if afraid to break this fragile moment. The sounds reached the customers through the huge windows of the restaurant, and the conversations at the tables gradually died down. Heads turned towards the windows, and others began to get up from their seats, heading for the exit. The first elegantly dressed, curious people appeared on the threshold of the restaurant with glasses of wine in their hands. They looked puzzled at the fragile girl with a dirty face, playing the sweaty violin. Mark, the restaurant manager, noticed that more and more guests were going outside. This was unusual. Usually guests enjoyed the warm light and cozy atmosphere inside. Surprised and slightly worried, he headed for the door to find out what was happening. Attracted people's attention, he went out onto the porch of the restaurant and saw a scene that took his breath away. Among the passers-by and customers gathered at the entrance stood a fragile girl. Her fingers ran over the strings of the violin with amazing skill, and her face expressed complete immersion in music. Despite its shabby appearance, the violin sounded like it was telling a story that moved anyone. Mark watched in silence for a while, not daring to interrupt this magic. He was amazed by how such a small figure, barely dressed for the frosty night, could radiate so much power and emotion. The girl's music filled the street with warmth that was missing in this cold city. It touched even those who usually walked by without noticing anything around. He watched for a while longer, then asked, "Are you hungry?" Sophia stopped playing, a little scared. The stomach answered before she could even open her mouth. She hesitated, accustomed to not trusting anyone. "Yes," she whispered, barely audibly, as if afraid that admitting hunger was a weakness that could be used against her. Mark nodded, not asking any more questions. He opened the restaurant door and gestured, inviting her inside. "Let's go," he said. "You can relax and warm up here. Eat something and then, who knows, maybe you can play for our customers." Sophia hesitated again, but the smell of food overwhelmed her senses. Seductively, she took a step forward, clutching the violin to her chest tightly. When she entered the restaurant, warmth enveloped her instantly. The aroma of freshly baked bread and delicious food filled her lungs, like an explosion of smells she hadn't felt in a long time. Elegant people looked at her curiously, but she kept her head down to avoid attracting attention. Mark guided her to a table. A separate table, where she could be unnoticed, was the perfect place for her. The sight of the hot dish that was brought to her made her almost cry. She began to eat slowly, afraid that this moment might disappear very quickly. Every bite was like a relief. Mark's silence next to her gave her confidence. After a few minutes of silence, Mark broke it by pointing to the violin that Sophia never let go of. "You play beautifully," he said. "How long have you had that violin?" Looking up from her plate, she replied, "Since then. Since I can remember, my only friend Mark has always been there for me. He always smiles, impressed by my words. He invites me to stay here for a while, and when I'm ready, he wants me to play. For his guests, he says my music is special and people need to hear it. I feel surprised and look up at him, stunned by the intensity of his gaze. I mutter, not believing what he's saying. He smiles and raises his hands, reassuring me. "Don't worry," he says. "Play the way you always play. I'll make sure everything goes well." I look around at the elegantly dressed guests, the soft lighting creating a cozy atmosphere, and the delicious dishes on the tables. I feel even smaller and more out of place, but there's something in Mark's voice that inspires confidence. He doesn't seem to care about my hairline or tired appearance. After finishing the meal, Sophia silently enjoyed every bite, as if it were her last. The simple dish, by the standards of the restaurant, was a real feast for her. She carefully held the violin in her lap. Her touch was gentle and reverent, as if the instrument were made of fragile glass. The violin was her treasure, the only link to a past that she barely remembered. Mark watched her carefully, noting how carefully she handled the instrument. He motioned for her to walk to the center of the hall. The guests noticed the movements and became curious. Some moved on, while others just watched with interest. Sophia felt her heart beginning to race. Mark noticed her indecision and whispered softly, "Don't be afraid. You've already played for many on the streets. Everything is the same here, only warmer and people will truly listen to your music." Sophia took a deep breath and stepped forward. Silence began to fill the restaurant as the guests realized something was about to happen. The instruments were put down, conversations died down, and all eyes turned to the young girl in the center of the room. Sophia raised her violin to her chin, closed her eyes, and let her fingers find the strings as she began to play. The music soon gained power, like a story being told through each note. The music from the violin was both melancholic and life-affirming. Time and space were captured in the melody, and some felt their hearts tighten without knowing why. The music seemed to speak of pain and perseverance, loss and hope. Mark, who stood next to Sophia, looked on with pride. He knew she was talented, but he had never imagined how she became part of the music. Each note was a continuation of herself. As Sophia played, the guests' gazes began to change. What had been silence was now filled with the beauty of her music. She became more than just a performer. She was a part of the melody. Just curiosity turned into admiration. The elderly man, in the suit, sitting by the window, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. He was touched to the depths of his soul by the melody, which the couple, who initially seemed indifferent, now held hands under the table and silently immersed themselves in the sound. Sophia slowly opened her eyes, as if waking from a dream. Silence reigned in the hall for a moment, but then timid applause rang out from one of the distant tables. Gradually, others joined them, and soon the entire restaurant burst into applause. The guests stood up from their seats, expressing elation and gratitude for what they had heard. Sophia stood motionless, stunned. She had never heard such applause on the street. Her music was rarely noticed, with passing people taking quick glances or just a small thing. But here, it was something completely different. Something she did not know how to accept. She looked at Mark, who was also stunned. He was looking at her with a broad, proud smile. There was genuine joy in his eyes, as if he knew he had done the right thing in inviting her there. Sophia had barely made it on time. Suddenly, the door to the restaurant opened, letting in a cold wind that forced everyone to turn towards the Alfei entrance. A man in his middle age with an authoritative look stood there, his face serious and his eyes sparkling with displeasure. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed, warmth and joy giving way to tension. It was Alexei, the owner of the restaurant, and his appearance always attracted attention. Now, he was clearly in a bad mood, his gaze moving slowly across the room. He stopped at Sophia, still holding her violin, her clothes messy, and her hair disheveled. Her tired look did not escape his sharp eyes. Alexei clenched his jaw, barely restraining his irritation. His voice cut through the air sharply. "What are you doing here?" Here's what happened. Mark, trying to remain calm, took a step forward. It was a girl. She was playing outside, and I decided to invite her inside. She has incredible talent. Alexei, a guest on the street, interrupted him, raising his voice. "You thought that it was a good idea to bring a street performer to my restaurant and have her play in front of my customers." His words felt like a knife being stabbed back into me. Her fingers tightened on the violin, and she was ready to run away. But her legs wouldn't move. Alexei said that she was not just a street performer, but she was talented. Her music had made this evening special. "Look at the guests," he said. "This is not a concert hall, but an elite restaurant." And he would not tolerate anyone ruining his reputation. Sophia felt a lump rise in her throat at Alexei's words, his gestures, and his contempt. It caused her unbearable pain. Step back, ready to run away, but at that moment, a voice rang out from the far corner of the hall. A calm but firm voice was heard, and all eyes turned towards the table where a man in an elegant suit was sitting. He stood up, his posture confident, and his gaze calm, but at the same time determined. It was Dmitri, a well-known entrepreneur in the city, a man with an impeccable reputation. Alexei turned to him, trying to hide his confusion. He knew who Dmitri was and understood that his words could be interpreted as an insult. "I hope you understand that I am trying to maintain the high standards of this place," Dmitri said, ironically. "Your tramp, as you call her, brought more emotions and beauty to this evening than your entire restaurant with all its luxury." Alexei frowned, his face flushing with irritation, but he tried to remain calm. Dmitri Sergeyevich continued, "You should understand from the beginning that such actions can harm the reputation of our restaurant. Our customers pay for an elite service and expect a certain level of quality. Your actions today have gone beyond that level." Dmitri interrupted, him raising an eyebrow. His voice was calm but firm. "I think your customers today received something more valuable than a dinner in a beautiful setting. They experienced the true beauty of music and art. You have touched everyone in this room." His words caused a stir among the guests. Many nodded in agreement, and some even began to clap in support of the girl. Alexei fell silent, his gaze darting between Dmitri, Sofia, and the guests. He understood that arguing with Dmitri Sergeyevich would be unwise, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "Dmitri," Alexei said, "I respect you, but I must say that what you are saying is wrong. Beauty, sincerity, and talent are not things that should be left outside the door just because they don't meet our standards. The true value of a place like this is not just in its interior or its menu." Dmitri paused, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Alexei pressed his lips together, a mixture of anger and frustration on his face. He looked at Sofia, who stood clutching her violin to her chest like it was her only defense. "Finally," Alexei spoke again, "but this is the last time I will allow you to speak to me like this. In the future, I will not tolerate it." "I understand," Dmitri replied, his voice softer than before. "Let's move on. Tonight's performance has been exceptional thanks to this young woman. I think you'll understand, Dmitri." Turning to Sofia, his expression softened. He took a few steps towards her. Stopping next to her, his eyes carefully studied her features, seeming to flash something familiar. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. "Sofia," the girl whispered, barely looking up. "Sofia, you play wonderfully." Dmitri's voice became even softer. "Your music touched us all." Sofia was silent, still playing her violin. Her eyes, accustomed to indifference, could hardly accept these sincere words of support. Dmitri leaned a little closer, his gaze serious but friendly. "Tell me, Sofia," he asked cautiously, "where did you get this instrument?" He pointed to her violin. The girl lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening on the violin. "It's a gift from my mother," she replied softly. "She gave it to me when I was young." I left the room, and the girl's words had caused an unexpected reaction in Dmitri. His gaze froze on the violin, and suddenly his face paled. He took a step back, as if he had seen something incredible. "It can't be," he whispered faintly. Sofia looked at him in confusion, not understanding why his reaction had become so strange. "Where did your mother get this?" Dmitri asked, his voice trembling. Sofia shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know. Mom always said it was her most precious gift." Dmitri fell silent, his gaze darting between Sofia and the instrument in her hands. Something inside him made him remember the pain and loss he was trying to forget. Finally, he said, his voice barely audible, "What was your mother's name?" Sofia looked at him with confusion in her eyes, filled with uncertainty. She managed to squeeze out a response. "Her name was Anna," she whispered. "I don't remember her very well. It was a long time ago." The name sounded like a thunderclap to him. Dmitri's eyes widened, and his breathing stopped. The name was deeply connected to his past, to the pain he had tried to suppress for so long. "Anna," he repeated, as if checking if his voice had misheard. His voice trembled. "Your mother. How did she look? Do you remember?" Sofia hesitated. her face tense. She tried to remember images deeply hidden in her memory. "Her blonde hair?" she said finally. Her voice trembled again. "She always smiled when she played the violin. She said music was all we had." Dmitri closed his eyes, as if memories overwhelmed him. He saw the face of a woman he had lost years ago. Anna, his Anna. The woman he loved more than anything, but who had been taken away by tragedy. Sophia. His voice filled with emotions he could no longer contain. "You're saying that it was her violin. She handed it to you." The girl nodded, clutching the instrument tightly to herself, as if she was afraid it might be taken away. "Yes," she replied softly. "She said that it was the most precious thing she had, and that she wanted you to play it. But then she disappeared." Sophia faltered, her voice trembling as she tried to hide her emotions. Dmitri felt everything inside him turn over, and he carefully approached the girl, bending down and looking into her eyes. "Sophia," he said, his voice sounding soft, but with a hint of determination. "You don't understand. You're my daughter." The words came as a bolt from the blue, and Sophia froze. Her eyes widened in shock as she stared at Dmitri, trying to process what she had just heard. She whispered something back, but it was hard to make out. Dmitri shook his head, and his eyes filled with tears. "It's true," he said, pulling out an old photograph from his jacket pocket. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the photo and handed it to Sophia. "Your mother, Anna, was my wife. I thought I had lost her that day, on the day of the accident." Sophia looked at the photograph, which showed a young Dmitri smiling, hugging a woman with soft hair and warm eyes. She was holding a bouquet of wildflowers, and on her lips was a smile that seemed familiar to Sophia, but distant, as if from a dream. Sophia exhaled, running her fingers over the old, slightly worn photo. Dmitri nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "This was the last photo we took together," he said. "She's all I have left. Anna and I now understand that you were a part of our family, a part of me." Sophia looked at the photo again, feeling emotions rising in her chest. Her hand shook and she carefully held the picture to her heart. "No," she whispered. "It can't be."
"True." She carefully held out her hand, her eyes begging for trust.
"Sophia, I know it's difficult to accept," he said. Sophia was silent, her hands shaking, clutching her violin, not knowing what to say. Her world, which she had always considered cruel and empty, was suddenly beginning to crumble. The guests in May. The restaurant watched the scene in silence, no one daring to move towards the girl. His voice became even softer. "My daughter, Sophia, I will never leave you again," he whispered. Sophia raised her eyes, a mixture of pain, disbelief, and hope in her gaze. "Why didn't you find me earlier?" she asked, her voice full of reproach. All this time, Sophia's words pierced Dmitri's heart, leaving him frozen in place. He knew it would be difficult for her to accept the truth, but he had no idea how deep her pain was. He began, his voice trembling. "I've been looking for you, Sophia. I looked everywhere, hired detectives, went to hospitals, orphanages, but it's all been in vain." His voice grew quieter, and his eyes filled with despair as he continued. "After the accident, they told me you were both dead. I couldn't accept it, and all this time, I've been searching and hoping." Sophia clutched her violin even tighter as if it were her last refuge from the outside world. "Then why didn't anyone find me?" she asked, her voice shaking with not only pain, but also anger. "I lived on the streets, slept on cold ground. No one even noticed I existed." Dmitri, unable to contain himself any longer, stepped towards her and knelt. Down, he took her small, trembling hands in his. "Forgive me," he whispered. I'm sorry for everything you've had to go through. I let you down, and your mother, Sophia, looked at him. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to think. This man in front of her looked sincere, but the years of pain and loneliness had made her distrustful. I don't know, she muttered, looking down. I don't know how to believe you. Dmitri closed his eyes. His face was full of suffering. You don't have to believe me right away, he said, but give me a chance. Let me prove that I'm really your father and that I want to be with you. Sophia was silent. Conflicting feelings were fighting inside her. She had lived alone for so long, and the thought of someone taking care of her was alien and frightening. The guests in the restaurant looked at her with sympathy. Some even wiped their eyes. All this time, Mark, who had been standing to the side, finally took a step forward. Sophia, he said gently, I understand that this is all hard, but this man seems sincere. Maybe it's worth giving him a chance. The girl looked at Mark. He was the only adult who had been kind to her during this time. His words calmed her down a bit. She was still hesitant. She finally said, in a barely audible voice, I'll try. Dmitri could barely hold back tears. He carefully stood up but did not let go of Sophia's hands. Thank you, he said quietly. I promise I won't let you down. Sophia may have felt a faint spark of hope for the first time in a long while. Her world was still filled with doubts and fears, but maybe next to this person she could find something more. Dmitri turned to Mark, his voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for everything you've done for her. If you hadn't invited her to the restaurant, I probably wouldn't have found her. Mark nodded, his face expressing joy for the girl. You should be with her. He said that Dmitri deserved love and care. He looked at Sophia again. Her eyes were no longer as empty as before, and there was a spark in them that he hoped to keep. Let's go home, he said, squeezing her hand a little tighter. A real home where you will be safe. Sophia nodded, uncertainly, but willing to take the first step. Dmitri gently took her hand, and they slowly headed out of the restaurant. The guests who watched applauded them. Some tried to restrain them, and despite the possible consequences, he knew that a new chapter had begun in their lives. That night, the air was cool, but for Sophia, it no longer seemed threatening. Dmitri stopped and looked at her, then smiled. Are you cold? He asked, noticing how she was clutching the violin to herself. Sophia shook her head, but he still took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but for the girl accustomed to hardship, it meant the world. The cold and indifference of others meant a lot to Sophia. They headed to a car parked nearby. As Sophia stopped for a moment, looking at the vehicle, she got into it carefully, as if afraid of damaging something. Dmitri opened the door for her and waited until she was settled in. He then fastened his seatbelt and got behind the wheel. Are you okay? He asked, looking at Sophia. She nodded, despite the fact that she had not eaten much at the restaurant. Her hunger was still strong. Dmitri understood her without words. We're going somewhere now, he said softly, touching Sophia's hand. She looked out the window, following the lights of the night city. She was not used to silence in a car. Her memories of trips were associated with noise, laughter, and the voices of her parents. But now, everything was different. After a while, they stopped at a small bakery where the light was still on. Dmitri went inside. Soon he returned with a paper bag from which the aroma of freshly baked pastries wafted. He handed Sophia the package. This is for you, he said. There are cherry pies inside. You'll love them. Sophia carefully took the package, as if it were a precious gift. She took a bite of one of the pies, and the sweet taste made her forget about the cold, at least for a moment. Dmitri watched her with a smile, seeing how much she enjoyed the treat. We have everything you need here, he said. You can take your time getting used to everything. Just know that you're safe here, Sophia." She answered, but her eyes became a little less alert with the floating light in the windows. The house seemed cozy but unusual for her. She asked in a barely audible voice. "Yes," Dmitri answered, getting out of the car and opening the door for her. "Welcome home," he said, holding out his hand to her. After a slight hesitation, Sophia accepted it, and together they walked inside. The warm air and the smell of fresh pastries from the oven enveloped them. The kitchens embraced them like a warm hug. She looked around carefully, her gaze falling on the family photos on the wall. She saw a woman with kind eyes holding a little girl in her arms. "Is this my mother?" she asked, coming closer to Dmitri. He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "Yes, this is your mother," he replied. "I promise that I will do everything to fulfill her dream." Sophia looked at the memories of moments that had long disappeared. From her memory, she turned to Dmitri, asking softly where her room would be. Dmitri smiled, leading her upstairs with a note of curiosity in his voice. He opened the door to a bright room with soft toys on the bed and books and a box of paints on the shelf. "It's all yours," he said. "You can do with it what you want." She slowly walked inside, her gaze falling on the teddy bear that was lying in the corner of the bed. Carefully picking it up, she hugged it to her chest and sat down on the bed. "Can I stay here?" she asked without looking up. Dmitri sat down next to her and hugged her shoulders, saying, "Of course, Sophia. This is your home." For the first time in a long while, something like hope flickered in her eyes as she looked at him. The next morning, Sophia woke up to the warmth of a blanket, the softness of a pillow, and the coziness of her new room. Unaccustomed to it, her gaze was drawn to the sunlight streaming through the window. Through the curtains, Sophia could see the toy bear she was still clutching tightly in her hands. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and muffled sounds could be heard from behind. Someone was cooking in the kitchen. Carefully, Sophia got up, feeling a little awkward, and walked to the window. Outside, the garden with its flowering trees, gravel paths, and small bench by the fountain seemed almost magical to her. She opened the door and walked downstairs, trying not to make any noise. In the kitchen, Dmitri greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Sophia," he said. "How did you sleep?" Sophia replied shyly. Dmitri placed a plate of pancakes and cup of tea on the table for her. "Sit down," he said. "We have a lot to do today. You need to eat well." Sophia sat down and carefully picked up her fork. As she ate, she felt a sense of comfort and belonging in that moment. The first pancake, and a faint smile appeared on her face. The taste reminded her of childhood, although she could barely remember those days. "Where will we go?" she asked. After finishing breakfast, Dmitri answered with a mysterious wink. An hour later, they were already driving through the scenic streets of the city. Dmitri stopped the car in front of a small building with a bright sign. Sophia read the inscription, "Art School." "What is it?" she asked in surprise. "Is this where you can learn to play the violin?" Dmitri explained. "If you want, of course." I looked at him, confused. "I'm not sure," she murmured. "Don't worry," Dmitri reassured her. "We'll just go in to see. No one forces you to do anything." He opened the door for her, and they walked inside. The school was filled with activity. A choir was practicing somewhere, and piano music was playing in another room. Sophia looked around, impressed by the beautiful surroundings. Dmitri watched his daughter without taking his eyes off the walls decorated with portraits of famous musicians. He was greeted by a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. "Good morning, Dmitri Nikolaevich," she said. "This is your daughter, Sophia." "Yes," he replied with a hint of pride. "Her name is Sophia." The woman crouched down in front of Sophia and looked into her eyes. "Do you play the violin?" she asked. "Yes, but only outside," Sophia replied softly. "It doesn't matter," the woman said gently. If you want, I can show you around our school and tell you a little bit about our classes." Sophia nodded hesitantly, and the woman led them into a spacious room with large windows where several violins were standing. Sophia looked at them with curiosity, but still kept her distance. "Do you want to try playing?" the teacher asked. "I don't know," she answered. Sophia lowered her head, and Dmitri approached her, placing his hand on her shoulder. "You can do it," he said with confidence. "Just try. No one will judge you." Sophia slowly approached one of the violins. She picked it up and gently ran the bow over the strings. The sound was quiet at first, but after a moment, her fingers began to move more confidently. She closed her eyes and focused on the melody that she remembered from childhood. When she finished, there was applause in the room and the teacher smiled. "You have a talent, Sophia," she said. "With such a gift, you can do great things." The girl looked up at Dmitri for the first time in a long time. She felt like her music was important not only to herself, but also to others. After leaving the art school, Sophia and Dmitri continued walking around the city. She felt a little confused, as the events of the last few days had turned her world upside down. She was not sure how to accept all the changes, but something new was beginning to grow in her heart. Hope. Dmitri suggested they go to the park, where he used to love walking with his family. They walked along the paths covered in golden leaves, talking about their dreams and hopes for the future. Sophia felt more at peace than she had in a long time, and she knew that no matter what happened, she would always have music to help her through life's challenges. Leaves and Sophia listened to Dmitri's stories about their past. He recalled how he played here with her when she was young, how her mother loved collecting bouquets of autumn leaves. Sophia tried to imagine those moments, but the memories still felt vague. "Why are you so sure I am who I think I am?" she asked. After a pause, Dmitri replied, "Sophia, I feel it. You are my daughter. Your face, your eyes, your talent. All this reminds me of when you were young. I know it sounds incredible, but my heart is never wrong." Sophia lowered her gaze, unsure what to say. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but her doubts haunted her. "I'm just afraid," she finally confessed. "I'm afraid this is all a mistake." Dmitri sat on a bench, inviting Sophia to join him. "You know, I'm scared too," he said, "but not because I might be wrong. I just want to believe in the possibility of something beautiful. I made a mistake, but I was afraid of losing you again. Life gave me a second chance, even though it took time for you to trust me." Sophia looked at me, trying to understand the sincerity of my words. There was no doubt in my eyes, only love and care that she hadn't felt in a long time. Over time, our days became filled with new meaning. Sophia began attending music school, and Dmitri noticed her talent. He supported her by buying books, helping her study new works, and attending all her performances. He was proud of her achievements, but most of all, he was happy that his daughter was coming to life, becoming more confident and happy. Sophia gradually became accustomed to the house and the feeling of security and care. She no longer woke up at night in fear of being alone again. Dmitri shared stories about her mother with her, about how funny and kind she was. Together, they began to piece together their shared life. Again, at one of the concerts where Sophia performed with the orchestra, Dmitri was sitting in the front row applauding the loudest. When she came out to take a bow, their eyes met, and he smiled at her with the same love and pride as on the first day they met. Sophia, looking at her father, realized that her life had changed. She had found not only a home, but also a family that would be there for her through all the fear, pain, and joy. They knew that there were many challenges ahead, but it no longer frightened her because she knew she was never alone. Thank you for listening to this story. Please leave your opinion in the comments below. If you like this video, please subscribe. to our channel and share it with your friends and family. This will motivate us to continue creating more amazing stories every day. Don't miss the next one that will appear on your feed. We are grateful for your support and look forward to seeing you again. You can find the full description of this video in the description box below. Open the catalog of all the stories. See you later.